Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for taking the time today to join the Progress webinar. I'm Kay Griggs, for those who don't know me. I'm the marketing lead for Progress in Asia Pacific. So today's webinar will have two subject matter experts sharing a very interesting information. And Lance Filler and Dale Orsolino, they will be sharing with you some really interesting data, as well as showing footprints, what footprints are left in the network at every step of an attack, and most importantly, how to detect it. So I would like to just pass that on to Dale and Lance so that they can share all the interesting stuff. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kay. Again, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm Lance, and with me is Dale, our engineer for the Asia Pacific region for Flowmon. This morning and afternoon, we have an interesting discussion about supply chain compromise, how we actually are able to detect supply chain, but of course, more importantly, why we even want to bother about supply chain attacks in the first place. So I think it's only fair that we start the webinar by calling out the simplest, most inconvenient truth in cybersecurity, that any organization is a target of a cyber attack, whether as a direct target or as an incidental one. With data as the new oil, companies have gone into huge extents of mining data to gain knowledge and make intelligent decisions to grow the business and respond to changing environments. Of course, this also makes information assets very lucrative to threat actors who will exhaust all means to be able to meet their objectives. And with today's business landscape, it's inevitable that companies will work with other independent entities, either to supply, to receive information, whether it's part of the supply chain to provide goods or services. For example, in the financial services industry, you have banks who will have to talk to other agencies like insurance companies, land registration authorities, for example, or as a part of legal, regulatory, or statutory requirements to government agencies, or even as part of the company's trust to optimize or enhance their operations. For example, when they acquire products or services from other providers. Working with other entities give organizations the chance to focus on delivering their core objectives. But of course, at the same time, it also widens the risk of misinformation and data loss across the chain. Over the last few years and months, we've heard of different cyber attacks. Unfortunately, for some of us, we have been close enough to the fire, using solutions that have been involved in data breaches or vulnerabilities, which greatly increase the risk from our end. As shared by ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, supply chain attacks actually are rising year on year, with more than half of them focusing on, in this case, exploiting source code. This makes a general end user very helpless, especially since outsourcing the development of systems is meant to take the headache off the maintenance and the risks introduced by doing something outside of a company's core competency. Risk management, therefore, should be exercised more rigorously so companies can weigh business impact and mitigate them accordingly. So there are a number of other things related to supply chain attacks that I
Lance?
To discuss. Deo, is there anything from the ENISA landscape that you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. But before we proceed with how the supply chain attacks happening right now, I think it would be wise to step back a bit and discuss about how supply chain actually really works, right? So I think that's one of the things that we can focus our discussions on. Let me just give you a brief insight on, just a briefer supply chain involves a wide range of resources. So it's not just literally about the software you purchase. So it's actually more into hardware or software. It can be the storage, it can be hosted in the cloud, or it can be hosted locally. It can be a distribution mechanism, web application, e-commerce, and etc. Right? Also, yeah, we heard this from 2020. One management software got in, got breached. Um, and get attacked with this. This is where it all started. But before that, Lance, everything supply chain attacks already been there, right? So let's just talk about the four key elements of supply chain. So we have the supplier, we have the supplier assets, we have the customer, and of course the customer assets. Now, for a supply chain, for a supply chain attack that we can consider it as an attack, it has to be a combination of at least the two key elements. Has to be the first attack can be the supplier that is actually used by the attacker to gain access into a wider range of attack targets. It can be, of course, the second attack will be the supplier assets. So it can be the supplier assets can be the code embedded into the supplier and then deployed into the customer's environment. So the target can be the final customer or it can be another supplier, but clearly the attack vector and the methods is actually just the same. Right. So yeah, thank you, Lance, for the yeah. Based on Inisa, 66% of the attacks actually focus entirely on the supplier's code. 58% of it actually aim to access the data. But the majority of the attack is still relying on used malwares, right? Or the malwares that we are all aware of. So we have what we're going to be sharing with you is a clear, an attack scenario. This is it can or it may happen to some of our organizations, as what Lance, my colleague Lance earlier discussed, that we have like several supply chains happening that we are not just aware of, right? So for this particular scenario, a help desk system supplier got compromised, and a compromised help desk system has been deployed to the customer. So the attack is mainly on the customer's endpoint. I mean, for this particular discussion, this the scenario, it's more about attacking the end customer, right? So how did the attacker gain access into? First, again, we discussed it earlier that it gained access from the breach from the compromised suppliers, right? So the compromised supplier may not aware of this. Um, yeah, it has the code. I mean, the attacker embedded a particular code that it can use as a backdoor that when deployed to the customer, to the end customer that they are not aware of, they now have a compromised application that they've been using from the supplier itself. So using the compromised code that is currently embedded into help desk system that get deployed to the customer's environment, the attacker now has a backdoor using reverse web shell that can either steal sensitive company data on the network or disrupt the company's organization, company's operation. So that's the clear objective of what the attacker is currently doing. So from this particular discussion, the attacker's IP address is 122.2.5.42. Now, it already knew the customers already, as a matter of fact, because it has already has the backdoor that's already embedded to the from the supplier's code. Now, what's going to happen here is that we will be talking about the end customers, how we can detect the attacks, right, made by the attacker itself, that has been deployed when the attacker embedded its own code into the compromised suppliers software that we deployed on the organization. So clearly what we're doing at, so the Flowmon appliance is technically just listening into the, let me just turn on my pointer. The deployment appliance is just listening into the traffic that is currently deployed into the customer's organization. So here, the help desk application, this is the one that's been compromised. This is where the embedded code has been deployed, and the organization has the DNS, an Active Directory server running Windows, and of course a Linux server. Just for the sake of simplicity of this discussion, we have the Linux server that we can use to also, this is one of the common ways the attacker can gain access into by looking at a possible targets, right? So we have a Linux server, we have a Windows server, and of course we have the help desk application that has the compromised code into it or the backdoor into it. So uh, once the customer already deployed the compromise help desk application into the customer's environment, of course the attacker already knows about that because he has information about the compromised code, right? So the first layer of the attack is reconnaissance. From this particular example, the attacker is scanning the internet for potentially vulnerable help desk systems. So it's not just one customer, right? We all know that. So the attacker somehow is scanning the internet for all the users of the vulnerable help desk systems. Now it's using Nmap. It's just using other attackers can actually use Shodan. Other attackers can use a lot of tools, by the way, but it's just same methods. Just looking at the possible target. So using Nmap 443, the attacker was somehow able to discover which customer is actually using that particular application. Now, once the attacker knew of the vulnerable hypno systems, it will then proceed with the validating the help desk system. So just simply using curl, just validating if like the target is really up or this is actually the exact server that is going to attack. Now the attacker using curl and the web server responded with the details. The attacker's perspective should be the attacker's perspective. It should have enough information how it can gain access to the system and probably do more attacks or additional enumeration into the customer's network. Now, after gaining or after validating the target itself, it would then try to gain access. Now, this is a malicious web, the web shell code that's been implanted or embedded during the when the attacker made the attack or attacks the supplier. So this is actually the web shell code implanted onto the application itself. Now, once done, by the way, once the reverse shell has been deployed or has been enabled by the attacker, it can now have access into the web server itself. So using Meterpreter from Metasploit framework, the attacker can easily move from one attack to the other using various tools. That's why the attackers really like to have really are using Metasploit framework because of how simple it is or how easy it is to use and how valuable the databases are, the kinds of attack it can actually use onto the possible target. So for this particular example, the attacker is now able to get in the vulnerable web server because basically the code that it embedded onto the web application has root permissions on it, so it can now do something about it, right? It can move laterally across. It can actually do download more tools that it needed for it to be able to successfully perform the attack. So from the Flowmon's perspective, Flowmon will be able to somehow detect the initial access made by the attacker into the customer's environment using the backdoor. So during the reconnaissance period, the attacker during when the attacker did the port scanning attack into the customer's environment, Flowmon detected the TCP scan, the horizontal TCP scan made by the attacker to the environment. So here we detected the multiple IP addresses responded. As a matter of fact, the attacker 1.2.225.42 is using port 443 to check the available ports across the myriad of targets. So yeah, the attacker is using /22, so it's actually looking at a possible target who's actually using the compromised web server. So here using Flowmon, we detected the TCP scans, how many attempts made by the attacker, what's the port number, and what's the time frame when the attacker made the attack, and of course when it was actually when the attacker was able to somehow get the information about it. So after the attacker made the reconnaissance period, when the attacker made the initial access, Flowmon was also able to detect that the web server, the compromised web server, has been detected has been communicating with a known attacker. So Flowmon has a database of known attackers, phishing sites, and etc. As a blacklisted IP addresses or IP reputational database. So during the time when the compromised server communicated with the attacker itself, Roman already said that, hey, you know what? There is a communication made by the attacker into a known IP address that's currently in your database right now. So during the initial access, during the reconnaissance period, the reconnaissance activity, Flowmon was able to detect and understand what's going to happen next. So um, if we have if a customer has a SOC that is currently looking at the attack, or the network itself, it should be enough for the SOC to investigate and validate the truthfulness of the current information that Flowmon presented to the organization. So as easy as that, we should be able to understand if there's going to be an attack happening soon, or there's going to be a breach going to happen soon. So once the going back into the attacker's perspective, now after the attacker found the target during the reconnaissance and somehow was able to gain access during the code that with the code that it injected, it will then start to discover internal assets. So it starts enumerating the internal resources. So it's actually trying to look at the compromised host network and understanding what it can do, what it can actually exfiltrate into the target or to the customer's environment. So using that's exactly why most of the attackers are using the interpreter, because it can easily download all the required tools that they need to actually do something more into the target itself. So here from this particular instance, the attacker just run a script and try to understanding what the local IP address, and of course the broadcast or the net mask itself, understanding how big or how huge the target really is. So using ARP scan, it will then understand, based on the local network, it would then go ahead and understand the possible target coming from itself, from the compromised server. So it would still try to look at the possible target using just a simple ARP scan tool. It will be able to detect the local network where the attacker can laterally move inside and get more details about the customer's environment. So here he detected that there's like three possible targets, right? 192.168.255.2, 3, and 254. So 254 could possibly a gateway. Now here, after doing the ARP scan, the attacker then starts to enumerate the open ports, probably just understanding the internal resources that it can actually use. It can actually use to gain more access or escalate its privilege by understanding the additional targets that it can actually compromise into the customer's network. So here, the attacker using Nmap, it actually tries to understand what kind of ports open to the possible target. So here we can see 255.2 that it's currently open. 53 is open using Microsoft DNS. 135.445, of course, the Samba file sharing, and of course the HTTP using 5357, right? So here we can the attacker now has more information about 255.2. So the attacker might do some more scouring on the available ports or fingerprinting, or probably looking at the vulnerabilities on each of these application. So he can probably use that for further action, further attacks. Now he also detected the 255.3 has the port 22 open. So meaning to say he can actually use 255.3 as a jump server for his further attack. So that really depends using port 22, right? So now, as an attacker's perspective, what I would do is probably look at the easiest way for me to attack is, of course, yes, it would be RPC, the Windows server. Then again, it would be easier for me to laterally move across. So using port 22, I can easily log in via SSH, create more or download more tools, or probably create a script that I can use to evade perimeter, that I can use to actually evade the endpoint security in place on a specific system. So here, using the attacker, what the attacker is actually doing is to try to log in using port 22, using password spraying attack. So password spraying is basically a simple password guessing, right? So this is actually not brute force attack, but password spraying is just a small amount of login attempts using a common combination of usernames and passwords. So technically, the chances of gaining access to a particular system using password spraying is really, really small. As a matter of fact, some of them really won't get you anywhere. So one of the of course, if that's going to be the case, the attacker would have to laterally move across, trying to figure out which system he has to, log in, or probably compromise, or probably exfiltrate the data from. Again, the best way to actually look into is using the attack. The best system to attack is actually the Windows Server. Now, Windows Server, during the reconnaissance, or during the port scan activity made internally, right? Couple of slides back, the attacker somehow discovered that the Windows Server is using file sharing. It has 445 open. It has the DNS server open. So what it does is, of course, I'm gonna understand, if in the attacker's perspective, the attacker would probably understand what's the application's firmware version running into, so he can look at the possible vulnerabilities on each of the applications. So maybe the application is running RDP. Maybe the application is running port 53. So for this particular example, the application the Windows Server, which is the target server, is running port 53, running DNS, right? And the attacker, of course, using interpreter, it downloaded, has a database of exploits, right, that it can use for a specific CVE. So the attacker somehow discovered that there's a CVE 2020-1350 on that particular version on the Windows Server. So what it does is just exploiting that particular vulnerability, so it can gain access into the application, into the server itself, using that particular application. And of course, it's already elevated, meaning to say the attacker already elevated its credentials. The attacker already was able to get in by exploiting the specific vulnerability. Now, after exploiting that vulnerability, it was somehow able to get in, was able to somehow create a shell with the highest privilege into the target system, which is the Windows Server. If you see from here, now the attacker was able to create a shell into the Windows Server from the .1 application help desk, which is the vulnerable application that that it got from the breach supplier. So here, using that particular vulnerability, it was able to get in the Windows Server and it can start analyzing what's inside the Windows Server. But of course, in an attacker's perspective, we need to stop any controls or any security controls that is currently deployed into that possible target. So using a simple script, using a simple commandlet from PowerShell, it stops the Windows Defender, and it actually created another shell and then downloaded the interpreter for Windows so it can do something about it. So after downloading the interpreter for Windows, the attacker then executed the interpreter, again, same thing, using PowerShell. Now, I've seen this a lot when investigating with endpoints, by the way. You might be seeing that a lot of scheduled tasks or a lot of communication made by PowerShell across the network. This is actually one of the things that the attacker can gain access in. Can actually do once it started gaining access to a Windows server. So for this particular example, the attacker downloaded the interpreter for Windows, so it can do something about it. It can do more into the Windows server. It can check what are the files are inside. it can actually laterally move across and then embed itself into the customer's network itself by not detecting any security controls in place. So after downloading and after enabling or powering on the interpreter for Windows, the attacker started to actually create additional shell for him to use inside the target server, which is the Windows server, so it can actually do move files from one place to the other. So from that particular perspective, when the attacker starts the interpreter tool on the Windows server and then creates a reverse shell again, it's actually creating a normal communication, right? From the 255.1, which is of course the attacker's jump off server, into the 255.2. So clearly, when an IPS is in place, it can only see a typical communication that is currently in the network. Now, Flowmon, however, is different. So using our algorithm, we detected the compromise and the persistency of the attack by understanding how the flows is actually running, or how the anomaly is actually running. So during the discovery, Flowmon detected the ARP discovery that's currently happening from the compromised server 255.1, and the target itself, which target it's trying to actually gain access into, or try to discover a possible port numbers or possible active device that it can gain access into. So here we can see that the attacker is trying to check the open ports from 1433, 513, etc. So all ports that the normal a server or normal endpoint may be using, right? So here we can detect, Flowmon detected that there's the attacker 192.168.255.1 is actually doing a port scanning activity across multiple targets. So looking at the target itself or the attack itself, Flowmon also detected that there's been a password spraying attack happening. So here, if you notice, the average attempt between the attempt on using the common username and password is just 3 seconds. For a brute force attack, is actually less than that. So technically, the attacker is guessing, doing a password guessing on the possible credentials that it can use to log in to the possible target. So this one was when the attacker 255.1 is trying to is doing a password spraying attack into the 255.3 using port 22, using SSH, right? And of course, when the attacker was not able to get in the 255.3 target and starts laterally moving using an exploit, using the vulnerability, DNS vulnerability 2020-1350, Flowmon also detected that the attacker is utilizing that particular vulnerability and exploited it so it can actually get in. So here we have details about the exploit happening. So where the source is coming from, right? And of course the destination IP address, and of course what port number is currently being used. It's currently being used. So here, in a perimeter's perspective, the perimeter would only see it as a normal query because it's using port 53. So technically, it appears that the target IP address 192.168.255.2 is just querying the source IP address 1.2.225.42 via port 53. So it will still allow the communication even if the attacker is utilizing an exploit or is utilizing that particular vulnerability to gain access or to gain into that the target server, right? So using this information again, the SOC or the security team will be able to understand what's really happening on the customer's environment, right? So technically, going back into the attack, so once the attacker already gained access into, say, into the target server, it was able to create the reverse shell, and then the reverse shell was able to, of course, and an attacker itself. I would like to know what kind of information I can get in. So here, the attacker transfers data from the Windows server going into the Ubuntu server that is actually running the help desk application. So the help desk application, the one that is actually the one that compromised. So the attacker starts exfiltrating important data from the Windows server going into the jump up server, which is the 192.168.255.1. So looking at the information, the attacker, since yeah, it already gained access. It's already enumerated, what kind of information it can actually collect. What's going to happen here next is to, of course, infiltrate the data coming from the Windows server, going into the help desk systems, the help desk server that has been compromised from the very beginning. So here the attacker created another tunnel using a DNS tunnel, using netcat and camouflaging it as a DNS request. So again, as mentioned earlier, that the IPS, or probably the perimeter firewall, will just see it, the communication between 255.1 and 1.2.2.2.542, which is actually the attacker itself, as a mere DNS communication. But what's happening right now is that there's a tunnel, a DNS tunnel, coming in from this guy over to the attacker's IP address, which is 225.42, and exploiting data, or exfiltrating data from the internal the customer's environment. So here exploitation of course leads to corruption. So of course, just to cover up the attack itself, the attacker needs to actually destroy the evidence, needs to destroy, of course, there's going to be an audit or who data enabled on the target system, for them to be able to jump, or stay away from the evading itself. Um, the attacker exploited another vulnerability that it actually figured out on the Windows server. So using vulnerabilities 283 or CVE 283112, which is a NTFS vulnerability, it can actually enable that one, and then destroys the Windows server itself. So after enabling that vulnerability, the Windows server will not be able to restore itself. So it will be actually destroyed, right? So the Windows server is offline. The file sharing is no longer available, and of course the company's operations has already been disrupted. So using that simple attack analogy, the objective has been accomplished. So using Flowmon's network detection and response, again, we will be able to understand the data exfiltration happening, made by the attacker going into the target organization. So here we detected that there's been a monitored network, there's a large transfer amounts of data within a shorter period of time. It gives us the details about what's really happening, right? So this may be an indicative or indicator of unexpected overload on the network. So technically, you can have information about what's really happening here. So we can use MITRE ATT&CK framework to know the tactic and technique made by the attacker to actually understand how the data has been exfiltrated, and we can see where the source is coming from, where's the target going into. So here we can see that the source is coming from 255.1, meaning that is actually the jump up server. This is the compromised server, and it is actually trying to exfiltrate the data going into 1.2.2.5.42, and of course 192.168.255.2. So what it's trying to tell us is that 192.168.255.1 is actually transferring data coming from these two IP addresses, right? So now clicking on the event evidence, it will give us more details about it. So going into the exfiltration itself, the data exfiltration over the alternative protocol, which is using DNS, has been detected by Flowmon's behavior analysis. So here we can see that there's a high amount of TCP DNS traffic. So we all know by default DNS is running UDP, right? So here we can tell that the data has been sent from 255.1 going into 122.2.542 is actually 310 megs of data using DNS itself. So here, instead of, in a SOC perspective, a security professional's perspective, we would be wondering why in the very beginning the DNS is using TCP. Secondly, why is it that at some point, right, a client or a node was able to transmit data as huge as 310 meg into the DNS server that is actually outside. So we can actually tell ourselves from the network perspective, from the server's perspective, that it's not supposed to happen. DNS is supposed to use UDP. DNS is supposed to be less than that amount of data to being transmitted, right? So we would know eventually that something's really happening. So using Flowmon's behavior-based methods or analysis, we can Flowmon is telling us that there's been a data exfiltration happening. So here, using the MITRE attack framework, we now understand that the tactic is exfiltration and the technique is exfiltration over alternative protocol. Now, it's not just gonna be just for the sake of discussion. It's not the alternative protocol. I've seen a lot that it's not just using DNS. DNS is one of the common protocols being used by the attackers nowadays, because one, it's simple. It's very easy to create or to cover that particular protocol. Other protocol is actually ICMP. So I've seen that a lot. ICMP is being utilized to exfiltrate data into one organization over the other. So the impact during which, after the exfiltration happened, after the attacker was able to somehow get the data from the target server, uh, after the attacker crashed the NTFS or the operating system on the target server, Flowmon then detected that the Samba server is not running. The server is really the server right now is not available. So here, in an operations perspective, we can then tell that something's really happening, and our company has been compromised. We got exfiltrated, and as a matter of fact, one of our critical application is no longer running. So we can have details about when it all started, when it got detected, and the last update coming from the Flowmon's investigation, when the service stops working, right? So here we can see more information. So in the event a root cause analysis needs to be provided into, or a initial root cause needs to be provided to the management as to why our critical organization or critical application is now running. We can then provide them that, yeah, you know what, the service is not available, based on the analysis made by Flowmon's behavior-based methods. So in a sense, right, in a summary, Flowmon provides us a complete picture about what's really happening based on a MITRE attack framework. So here we can see that there's during the reconnaissance period, reconnaissance attack, there's been like two techniques being used. So during the active scanning, when the during the initial access, there's a using external remote services, how the attacker was able to gain into our organization. Now, with the credential access, there's been two attempts using brute force. One of them is actually vulnerability scanning, vulnerability attack, and then the password spraying. So during discovery, we detected at least three times network service scanning, network share discovery, of course, remote system discovery. During the lateral movement, we can see the exploitation of remote service. This is the vulnerability exploit that we discussed earlier. And then during the exfiltration, we can see, like, what kind of techniques and in fact is being used, how many times is being used when it comes to the when the attack is happening, is ongoing. So the impact on with the impact itself, we can see that there's a denial of service, of course, when the with the vulnerability happening during the NTFS crash. um, it detected that the server is no longer available. So it shows us that the endpoints denial of service, meaning to say that the server is no longer available, right? So in a simple, in a glance, using the MITRE attack framework, we can easily understand how the attack happened, where the attack came in, and what kind of techniques and tactics is being used by the attacker. So we will be able to stop the next attack or next wave of attack, or probably prevent the further attacks from happening again. So here, this is a complete picture, drilling down into the MITRE attack framework, that we can prevent, or we can actually provide a visibility, or a timeline of visibility on how the attack happens, where the attack started, and of course, what's the method the attacker is trying to do, and how it's actually utilizing the compromised server to gain access and exfiltrate data from our organization. So looking at the timeline itself, so less than an hour, less than an hour, by the way, it was able to compromise the organization, was able to Flowmon detected the communication made with the compromised server, the attack happening via SSH. There's been an upload onto the DNS and etc. Right, so we can see there's a port scanning activity happening. So looking at this timeline, by the way, you can just click on each of the. It's actually color coded, so we would know, how, just to simplify the response, or just to simplify the investigation based on the attack methods made by the attacker itself. So when investigating an attack, it would be very important to understand the details. So we will be able to somehow create a remediation plan in the event that a particular attack is happening again, or we got the company will be breached once again, with similar fashion, right? So using Roman's network detection and response, we actually enables our customers, we actually provide our customers with the best application experience by providing network performance monitoring and diagnostics, network detection and response, and of course application performance monitoring. So how does Flowmon work? Is very simple and very straightforward. Flowmon has two solutions. We can have the Flowmon collector. I'm just going to talk about the collector first. So the Flowmon collector, what it does is collects the information coming from the cloud platforms, coming from the routers and switches, even from the progress load master, even from the probe itself. So it collects the information via network telemetry using NetFlow, IPFix, SFlow, or JFlow, and then exports that into the Flowmon collector. Now the Flowmon collector, what it does is it stores that data into a longer period of time, right? So it can be deployed as a hardware appliance, as a virtual appliance, or it can be deployed in the cloud. So in the cloud, it can be deployed on AWS, it can be deployed in GCP or in Azure itself. For virtual appliance, it can be deployed on Hyper-V, KVM, or ESXi. Now the data, the Flowmon collector collected from the sources, cloud platforms, routers, and etc., will be used to be analyzed. That can be used for network visibility and troubleshooting. That can also be used for network detection and response. This is where we detected the supply chain attack that is currently happening on the customer's environment. We can also use the Flowmon collector and Flowmon probe to do a full packet capture and analysis. So in the event we need to do forensics analysis, we need to understand what kind of data has been exfiltrated. Then we need to capture the whole payload itself. We need to capture the whole packets for us to further investigate. And we can also use the data that we collected from the Flowmon collector for application performance monitoring. So it's not going to be an agent-based application performance monitoring. As a matter of fact, this is a network-based application performance monitoring. So what it does is, as the traffic passes along going into the application, the Flowmon then analyzes the latency going to the application from the client to the front end to the back end, and etc. So what if say a customer could not doesn't have the routers and switches, or it can't deploy the telemetry on the routers and switches or in the cloud platforms. So here we can deploy a Flowmon probe. So the Flowmon probe, what it does is it listens to the traffic, the raw traffic in the network via mirror or via span, and then generate the raw data that it collects or that it listened into, and then generates a net flow, and then exports that into the Flowmon collector. So the Flowmon collector will then again store that information that it collected, the raw traffic that it collected. It has an enriched flow. So here the difference between the routers, switches, and even the cloud platforms is that it focuses entirely on the layers 3 and 4. Flowmon probe, however, focuses up to layer 7 of data, right? So it collects up to layer 7 of traffic. It actually creates it calculates the latency from the client to server communication, and then export that into the Flowmon collector. So the Flowmon collector has more information about the traffic, has more details about the network organization, or about the network. And if there's a latency happening, we can make use of the network visibility and troubleshooting. All right. So in the event that the cloud, the organization has deployed in the cloud, we can you can deploy a virtual instance of Flowmon virtual appliance on the cloud platform, right? So we can have a virtual, we can make use of the VTAP or the mirroring, mirroring all the traffic inter application communication within the cloud platform or within the cloud instance, or we can make use of the native vlog, the flow logs, right? So AWS is using AWS flow logs or Azure flow logs. So what we can do is technically just export the flow logs going into the Flowmon collector, which can be deployed on the on the cloud platform. And then we can have the Flowmon probe currently deployed on the customer's organization, right? So the Flowmon probe will then just collect via span the traffic from the organization. So it collect the raw traffic and then export that information into the Flowmon collector that is hosted in the cloud. So we can now detect all the traffic, all the threats that are currently inside the data on-prem data center or headquarter or in the branch, as well as the traffic made back and forth into the cloud instance, right? So we can now have an on-prem or hybrid kind of deployment that detects the traffic from the HQ or data center and the traffic made back and forth into the cloud applications. So using Flowmon, we can extend our detection capability. So using our proven MITRE ATT&CK framework, we can detect the discovery, we can detect the exploitation happening, the indicators of compromise, the communication to a command and control server, even the possibilities of data exfiltration can be detected as well using the Flowmon's integration with MITRE ATT&CK framework. So Flowmon, utilizing Flowmon's deployment, we can have the network telemetry using the reputation feeds, the IDS signatures, even the full packet data, and then combining that, we can make use of the algorithms that we deploy, like machine learning, adaptive baselining, behavior analysis, heuristic behavior, of course, reputation data, so we can have the events without or disregarding the noise or the false positives that we actually covered or detected during the attack. So here we can have the information as a result, as the event, as a relevant telemetry. We can use that for forensics and capture, or forensics and analysis. And of course, it can also be used for automated response. So Progress Flowmon is actually providing an effective network threat detection by using the right tools, covering the perimeter and endpoint security, and of course looking at the completing the security triad, and of course using the right framework, using the right methods and information as well. We actually providing our customers with a better response or approach into possible threats in the network. All right, so Lance,
Thank
any
you, Deo.
questions so far from
Yeah,
the
there's actually one question, no. The question is, if this in the scenario, if Flowmon is deployed or installed, how can NDR respond to the attack? Is it automated or manual?
That is actually an interesting question. Well, technically, it can be automated. So we have, like, we can integrate Flowmon NDR into various security controls, endpoint management. We can integrate Flowmon into a perimeter firewall to run a script automatically the moment it detected a communication to a blacklist attacks, or if it detected data exfiltration. So there's like a myriad of ways or a myriad of integration we can think of to put into place where Flowmon can actually help our organization detect and prevent any possible data exfiltration or breach into the organization.
All right, thanks, Deo. I'll also type the question in, the answer. Thank you, Ernie. There's another question here, no? What are the typical signs that we should be looking at in a malware attack?
Well, that's actually an interesting. Well, one of the common signs in the network detection is of course the known attackers, right? So if it started to communicate with a known attacker, if it tried to communicate with, let's say, anonymously, an endpoint accidentally tried to, like, instead of like at some point in time, one endpoint is not supposed, or one particular domain, it's not supposed to go on the internet, and then suddenly doing that. As a matter of fact, I had an experience wherein one printer has been communicating to a firewall via telnet, that's one good indicator of a compromised system. So here we can tell that, from an organization standpoint, telnet is not supposed to be, telnet is not a no-no. Secondly, a printer is communicating via telnet to the firewall is somehow, one way of us understanding that there's actually a breach happening into that particular organization. So yeah, using behavior analysis, you can understand that if there's a malware happening in the network, you can tell by understanding the behavior of the computers, of the nodes itself, where it's communicating into, how it's actually communicating. So using progress Flowmon, we can immediately tell, based on an indicator of compromise, that there is a target, or there is a breach, or there is an attack happening based on behavior each of the clients or the nodes that is currently in the network.
Thanks, Deo. Another question.
Right.
How
Sure.
how can you, I like it. I like it that there's a lot of questions. Huh? How can you detect 0 days?
Perfect. Now, yeah, when we detect 0 day, let's start to begin, right? What do we mean by 0 day? 0 day meaning to say these attacks, these threats are not actually available on the security controls signature, meaning to say there's not much understanding about it, right? So that's really a common way of telling that there's a 0 day attack. So a newly discovered vulnerability, of course, that doesn't have any patch available on it, or possibly a bug, right? So how do we discover it? So one thing, so same with what we saw earlier, wherein the attacker actually utilized an exploit or a vulnerability to actually get in. So using that particular exploit, the attacker was able to somehow get inside the network using that particular vulnerability. By just doing that, the compromise or the target itself doesn't know, even if a perimeter is already in place, right? So even if a perimeter already knows, there's actually an attack happening, but then it doesn't know that it's what's the attack is all about. So understanding how the 0 day works is one of the things that we can actually help you guys out, because one of the things we can detect how the attackers gain insight into our organization, even the absence, not really the absence, even without the signatures or of the attack itself. So understanding by the behavior of that particular threat can actually help us prevent the 0 day from happening into our organization or into our network. All right, so I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Deo. There are another two questions that have been asked. No? Number one, do you provide configuration templates? And then yeah, there's another question here. Can Flowmon block IP addresses?
Good. That's wow. Yep, I've heard that a lot. We've heard that a lot. Lance and I heard that a lot. No, just to be blunt and honest, no, Flowmon could not block the IP address. But again, we can integrate Flowmon to a perimeter firewall to automatically block or quarantine an IP address that's been communicating or that's been detected by Flowmon that's currently doing something in the network. So we have a lot of scripts available for big brands perimeter firewall. If you guys are interested, we can actually talk about this offline. We can do a quick demo. We can talk more about how we can actually perform that, or how we can actually do that by integrating Flowmon's detection capability into your currently deployed security control solutions.
So yeah, thanks, Deo. Let me rephrase also the answer of Deo, no, to help enlighten. As a technology, no, network detection and response is really looking at data that's passing through the network. So the way that it's doing it, it's very passive compared to the other solutions which are in the path. No? So for example, firewall. That's why Deo mentioned that instead of us doing that active blocking, we actually work with those solutions for them to do. We orchestrate the mitigation of those threats, of those anomalies.
Yes.
There's another question of can you provide an overview of the licensing model? No? Let me be the one to tackle that, Theo. Very
Thank you, Lance.
briefly, no? Si Flowmon, the way for us to detect those security incidents across the supply chain, in this case, we actually install a module on top of the collector. They described earlier the architecture of Flowmon. There is a module that we install, which we call Flowmon Anomaly Detection System. And the way that it's licensed, it's actually based on the number of flows per second that are being processed. So the quick answer to that is it can be we can have a model for as low as 100 flows per second of processing stream data as well as behavior patterns, up to the high hundreds of thousands. So we have small organizations that use Flowmon in the size of 500 to 1,000 employees, that are using Flowmon for this purpose. But we also have deployments in the millions of end users, such as the case, for example, in Gayant. Gayant is the pan-European network, national research and education network. So basically, Gayant is an organization whereby there are different universities and research education networks, that are using Gayant's network. When there are anomalies that are being detected, such as those described by Deo earlier, Gayant will be able to detect them, and they can talk to those different institutions and either alarm them about what's happening or even mitigate them upfront. So this is how typically Flowmon's anomaly detection system is actually deployed. There was another question, Deo, do you provide configuration templates?
Yes, we do. Configuration templates actually can help us simplify the deployment. So in as fast as 30 minutes, we can now have a faster ROI of the solution, because one, we don't need to manually create everything. We can make use of the configuration templates. So all we're gonna do is, once the data starts coming in, using the templates, we can now have a workable data or workable dashboard that we can actually make use of.
All right, thanks, Deo. There's another question here. Can you explain how, for example, EDR solution provide the information flow to the collector?
Perfect. Now that really depends on the EDR platform. So I have an experience with one of the EDRs. It's not the enterprise grade, but it's actually an open source utilizing ELK. So Flowmon actually created, or just made use for as a source of itself to the SIM the EDR is currently using. So the EDR is also one of the source to the to the scheme of things, to the SIM that this organization is actually using, and they use that to correlate the information from the EDR perspective and to the NDR's perspective. So technically, it's more like correlating the information from the EDR when the attack happens, say a PowerShell has been detected, and then correlating that into the NDR using Flowmon to the SIM to understand how it actually affected the whole organization. So in a sense, that's how we integrate EDR and NDR in a bigger scheme network, of detecting any possible threats to laterally move across the environment. So I hope that actually answers the question.
Thank you,
Any other
Leo.
questions,
So,
Lance? Yeah.
yeah, if there are more questions, I think it's best that we just follow up after the webinar. So feel
Yes.
free to approach us. But actually, now we're up to summarizing everything that we've discussed in this session. I think it's good to go back to go to the high level and look first what are the truths that we're facing. That number one, all organizations inevitably increase their attack surface as a result of either organic growth or as a result of working with other organizations across the supply chain. Nowadays, every organization will have to work with other organizations, either to fulfill provisioning goods or services and fulfilling their mandate to their stakeholders, but also as a result of legal, statutory, regulatory requirements. And because of that, any organization is either a direct or an indirect attack of a cyber attack. Another important point to mention is that threat actors will persistently explore IT networks because they will have to find different ways to be able to get to where they want to go. and they'll really be persistent, no, in navigating, in escalating privileges to be able to advance their targets using a mix of zero-day attacks as well as rehashed or I would say supercharged the old malware that we know. If you hear of the recent ransomware attacks, it's actually a rehash of some old malware added with some other methods. No? And finally, organizations will need to revisit risk management activities. No, at the end of the day, cybersecurity is, well, let's face it, it's a lot of spending. But all of that spending, all of the implementation of controls should be tied up to an organization's risk appetite. No, understanding what are the kinds of threats that are out there and how relevant these threats are to them. Organizations should be able to reassess the threats introduced by the supply chain and look at and in this case, no, by reassess we mean look at different domains of information security. No, you look at contracts, for example, with your different third parties. You look at how you are doing outsourcing of development or procuring your solutions to be able to ensure that the organization is as much protected as it can be. And for the benefit of our presentation today, we would like to reiterate or emphasize, no, looking at network data as a key source of data for these growing cybersecurity risks. Network data, as described by Deo earlier, no, it's different. It has a different scope from what an endpoint detection and response solution is doing, as well as it's different from what a perimeter security is primarily doing. So network data is a key area, no, where a lot of anomalies can actually be seen, and with the right tools, an organization will be able to coordinate or automate, no, the response to respond to these different threats. I think that's it for this morning's session, no? Kay?
Very good. Wow, that's a lot of information. Thanks, Lance and Dale, for sharing all the interesting information. And I think from the audience, I really appreciate your time taking part of your day to attend this webinar. I do hope that what was shared was useful to you. And if there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to add on to the chat, and we can definitely follow up after the webinar. I'd appreciate if you could, after, when you leave in the webinar, you probably see a pop-up with some feedback from you. So if you can provide us feedback, and then there's a section for any comments as well. So any questions or anything that you'd like to hear more about, then please feel free to approach us. With that, thank you very much. Have a great day, and thanks to our speakers, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.